In today's video, I'm going to go over what's in a typical real estate contract because although we're all in different states, most contracts have some of the very standard things throughout. So I'm going to go over those. There are 11 things that I'm going to go over. I'll go over them quickly, I promise. And I'm going to also talk about two things that you should have added to your contract if you're buying a home. I'm Shaheedah Hill, getting you over the hill to home ownership and helping you confidently buy your first home. All right, so the first thing is your legal address. Now, although most people just have a street address, right? 123 Main Street, and the city and the state and the zip code, there may be similar addresses. So they want to make sure you have a legal description of that property on the contract and the correct legal description. So it may include things like a lot number, a district number, a section, a subdivision, just more detail into what that specific address is so it's not confused with any other similar addresses. So that's number one, legal description. Number two, the purchase price. How much are you offering for this house? Of course, you can offer what the list price is. You can offer more or you can offer less, but you're going to be putting what you're going to offer for that property. Number three, seller's contribution to closing costs. Now, are you asking the seller to contribute to your closing costs? In most states, sellers cannot contribute to your down payment for most loans. However, they can contribute a certain amount or percentage to your closing costs. So a lot of people ask, depending on what kind of market you're in, if you're in a seller's market, you may not ask for that much in closing costs. If you're in a buyer's market, you probably will ask for more in closing costs because it's going to make your purchase as a buyer more affordable if you're asking for the seller to pay for some of your closing costs. And I have several closing cost videos. You may want to watch that next. But there'll be a section typically as to how much you're asking that seller to contribute to your closing costs. Number four, and I have my thing so I won't forget anything. Number four is closing date and possession. When would you like to close on this property? And when would you like to start occupying that property? They could be the same date or it could be a different date. So ideally, they're the same date. So if you say, I want to close on February 1st, 2026, right? That means that you're going to take possession on the day of closing. You want to close that day and you want to take possession that day. But say the seller says, or the seller needs additional time to move out, you may close on February 1st and you may give them or they may give you possession on February 5th, for example. So closing date doesn't have to be possession date, but you probably want it to be on the buyer side that both of those things are the same. So basically, after you close on the property, you get the keys, you can go straight to that house. You own the house as soon as it's closed. So, and there are different reasons why you may want to give the seller a few more days, but those things have to be negotiated. And it's usually because there's more competition for that property, or they're paying you possibly. If there's a lot of competition, you may give them a later possession for free as part of the negotiations, but you want to have that conversation if you're working with an agent, you want to have that conversation about closing and possession. And ideally, you want them to be on this at the same time, but please watch my video on what happens if the seller does not close so you can get an idea if you give possession later, because sometimes you still own the house and in some states they become a renter for you. It's a lot of things that happen when you give them possession after closing. All right, so number five, who are you going to close with? So some states require you to close with a closing attorney. Some states require you to close with a title company. So you need to figure out, are you going to close with a closing attorney? And if so, which one? Or are you required to close with a title company and which one? So then, and usually the buyer can choose who they want to close with because a lot of times that's part of your closing costs, but everything is negotiable. So talk about that with your agent ahead of time. Number six, how much earnest money are you willing to put up to purchase this home? And let's talk about what earnest money is really briefly. Now, if there was no consideration, if there was no money put up by the buyer, buyers would just go around making offers on homes with no consequence. Oh, I want to buy this house for 400,000. You write a contract, you set a closing date, but there's no money, and you say, "Hey, I changed my mind. I don't want to buy your house anymore." And a lot of times there's no consequence to that buyer unless the seller is going to sue you in court and say, you said you were going to buy my house and you didn't, that sort of thing. But earnest money is something that you are putting up to the seller to let them know that you're serious about buying that property. And if you were to cancel outside of some of the contingencies that you may have in that contract, that they could keep your earnest money as damages if you change your mind. A good rule of thumb for earnest money is about 1% of the purchase price. So if you're buying a $400,000 house, it'd be $4,000 that you're putting up for earnest money. But this varies by state, by city as to what the averages are. But as a buyer, you want to put up as little earnest money as possible because you want to, try to mitigate as much as possible your losses. But on the seller side, the seller wants as much earnest money as possible because they want to see that as a serious buyer. Because a lot of times when people are putting up significant money, then they know they're probably not going to walk away from that very easily. So that's what earnest money is. And you'll put the amount of earnest money that you're willing to put up. And earnest money is not always required. And again, these are some general things, and every state may vary. But I like for you to ask your agent to go over your state's contract or what contract they're going to be using to make offers ahead of time. Because if you don't go over it ahead of time, what typically happens is you go looking at properties, you find a property, they put in an offer, they send that contract to you electronically to sign, through DocuSign or something similar. And a lot of first-time homebuyers don't really read the details. They'll just go ahead and sign and not fully know what they're signing. So I like for your agent to review the state contract, whatever contract you're going to be using, explain all the sections to you before you even look at a property, before you're even thinking about putting in an offer, because sometimes it might be more rushed, or you might be in a competitive situation and you may not read it as closely as you need to. All right, let's go to number 7. So now you've decided how much earnest money you're willing to put up, but you also have to know who's going to be holding that earnest money. There's usually 3 options for this earnest money. It's either your broker, your agent's broker, the listing agent's broker, or it's going to be the closing attorney, or in some cases, the title company may hold it. So, an outside party needs to hold it just in case there's a dispute with this money, then they determine who gets it. But again, this is going to vary by state. So you want to have this conversation with your agent to understand how that part works. And again, in addition to these 11 things, I'm going to tell you 2 things you need to add to your contract. All right, number 8 is your inspection and due diligence period. You should have somewhere in your contract time to inspect that property and to get your earnest money back that you put up without consequence if you change your mind. So it's going to vary again by your state, but ask your agent, what is my due diligence? Like, once you put an offer in, the offer is accepted, you want some time to investigate further that property, and it's usually through inspections. Like, you want to inspect the roof, you want to inspect the plumbing, the electrical, all of the major components. You may want to look more detail into the schools. You want to have some time before you make a decision where you're going to lose money. So usually that's going to be part of some kind of due diligence, an amount of days that you're asking that seller, like, I need this amount of time to do my due diligence to figure out, is there anything in this house that I need to look out for, and potentially either walk away from this deal if I'm not comfortable with the home, or to renegotiate this contract if I find things, I still want the house, but I find things that I want you either to give me a credit for or for you to repair before closing. So there's going to be some kind of due diligence or inspection period typically in contracts. Number 9 is lead-based paint. So prior to 1978, a lot of homes were built with lead-based paint. So you may find this in your contract. Again, it might be state specific that they need to acknowledge whether or not that home may have, especially in older homes, if it may have lead-based paint. And then number 10, there's usually somewhere in that contract that it shows who's representing who, like who your agent is representing and who the listing agent is representing. And so it's very clear who's representing who in the transaction. And then number 11 is usually there's going to be a time limit. When you're putting an offer on a property, then you don't want to leave an open time limit where they're able to accept it at any time. You want to put some sense of urgency for that seller to accept your offer or counter your offer. So there'll be some kind of deadline that you'll give them, a date and a time that you want a response by. And if they don't respond by that time, then they have to, you have to send them another contract. It starts all over. But if they accept it within that time, typically that's going to be a binding contract. Okay. So the 2 things, that's the 11 things that I feel like are typical in most contracts. And again, there may be some state specific things. That's why you want to have a really good buyer's consultation with your agent. The 2 things that I want to make sure you talk to your agent about adding to your contract, one is a finance contingency. So there was one in the main contract, there should be, hopefully, some kind of inspection, due diligence period. So you also want a period for a finance contingency. If something happens where, because most people are just pre-approved when they're putting in these offers, if something happens, maybe you lose your job, or maybe there's something that the lender sees that during underwriting that they didn't see initially, and you're not approved for this loan. If that happens, you want to be able to get that earnest money back. So there needs to be some kind of financial contingency that gives you enough time to figure out whether you're going to be fully approved for this loan. And then number 3, the last thing, is going to be an appraisal contingency. Now, most lenders are not going to lend you more than this house is worth, especially if you're getting a loan. So you want some kind of contingency for appraisal that says, hey, if this house doesn't appraise, I can either renegotiate, walk away, figure out what you want to do with this property without losing your earnest money. So try to get an appraisal contingency in your contract. All right, if you have any questions about what's typically in a contract, hopefully I can answer some of them for you, but this could be a good starting point for you and your agent when you're starting to look for a house. If you haven't already, please get my masterclass. Details are in the description of this video. Thank you.